not only through your community, through your industry, but also through your economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wertish.
Sorry. The biggest, like Brad mentioned, raising grains, it's not, you don't have a perishable commodity like milk. Obviously, they're in a different timeline on that. But you can only store it so long, and at some point, we need this. You really need the stability in the markets, because if you have all of a sudden the trade agreement is not enforced and your market goes down a significant number, you still got grain to market. You have loans to pay. You have debt to service. You can't just put it in the bin and tell your banker, "I'm sorry, I'll just pay interest." And sometimes they're fine with that. But if you're look at the younger farmers, don't have that kind of net worth. They have to move that crop every year, sell to be able to just cash flow and service their debt. So any uncertainty, disruption in trade agreements by not enforcing them definitely will hurt the younger farmers the hardest.
Thank you. Pleased to recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez, for any questions she has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wertish, you just spoke a little bit to trade enforcement and its benefits for U.S. farmers and workers that the Biden administration, it's very loud, has prioritized for farmers, workers, and families. Just to set the record straight, the USTR did in fact enact enforcement actions against Canada in the dairy sector and Mexico in the corn sector. Is that not correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you. And there have been a number of enforcement mechanisms that USTR has actually initiated as a result of the trade agreements that we've negotiated, one with Japanese beef, the other with the European Union for some of what we consider to be market barriers. So there is robust enforcement being attempted by this current administration. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And, some of the trouble runs that, it's not the administration's fault. Some of it is just the complexity of the agreements. When you're working with other countries around the world, the complexity is a lot of times the problem. It's not necessarily all the administration's fault. I believe the administration is doing some of the enforcement agreements within their power.
I think they're acting fairly aggressively, as a matter of fact, because their track record with respect to previous administrations' enforcement actions is actually grown exponentially. I want to ask about, we are in the midst of renegotiating the Farm Bill for this year. During a Farm Bill year, how can federal and tribal governments work with farmers to promote not just production, which is necessary and important and which we want to encourage, but we also want to encourage it in an environmentally safe way. So how can we work with farmers to promote environmental stewardship as well as we look to reauthorizing the Farm Bill?
Well, one thing I'd like to thank the current administration or the USDA for their climate smart technology or the programs that they're initiating and providing funding. A lot of that is, we all want to do a good job environmentally. I think we all can agree that as farmers, we're doing a better job than we did, say, our forefathers did. And a lot of that is through technology, and some of it is just plain learning how to do things better and taking things a little more serious and seeing what the damage was actually happening, which we didn't realize it. At one time, you see it in a lot of your manufacturing companies are built along rivers. You had a lot of farms built along creek sides. That part is being taken care of. That is being addressed. So I think, any type of funding or incentives that you could put in the Farm Bill to help farmers do that. Farmers, you're always it's always a tough time cash flowing. You don't have high prices all the time. Right now, our prices are sliding, and our inputs are high. So that it's getting to be very tight to even be able to pay your bills. So any incentives that we can get for the farmer to change some of his practices, maybe change some of the type of equipment, it's really a benefit to everybody. Because if you're up against, just wondering if you're going to actually be able to pay your loan back, and if your banker is going to go along with you another year, it's pretty hard to change your practices on your farm because you just can't afford to. Then it gets to be you might want to do you might see something out there that would do a better job, but financially you just can't afford to take that risk, because by taking that risk, if it doesn't work exactly the way you wanted, you could lose your farm.
Very understandable. And finally, I was wondering if you could speak briefly to the current challenges concerning the labor workforce that the agricultural industry is facing. We know that there are worker shortages in many different sectors, but specific to agricultural industry, can you speak to that?
Yeah, there's no doubt that, as all of the United States is addressing labor shortages, it is hitting the farmers hard. Brad here is a dairy farmer. It's hitting the dairy industry hard. I have a couple members that are a little bit larger vegetable type operations. They're having a hard time getting employees, and we have a few members that are just commercial, regular commodity type farmers. They rely on some help from, they've been using South Africans, but they've had a harder time getting them here. So they're definitely immigration alone and some of the H-2A visas. If we could, anything we could do to speed it up and really address the immigration problem is what you might call it, because those workers, in most cases, those people want to come here. And we have people that are willing to come here and work, but they can't get here. So sometimes they come illegally, and then that just creates another issue.
We have tried with the bipartisan Farm Workforce Modernization Act. We've not been successful in making that law, but we are working on that. And finally, Mr. Chairman, before I yield back, I just want to comment for Ms. Olson. Getting goods to market is important, and so that's why I'm very pleased in the last Congress we passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill to try to improve ways to move goods and services efficiently throughout different regions. And with that, I will yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Fishbach is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Carolyn, thank you so. Ms. Olson, be more formal, but thank you so much for being here. And enforcement of existing trade agreements is a critical issue across commodities, and I think we've talked about that a little bit. Proposals from Mexico regarding their unscientific ban of genetically modified corn is a recent reminder, and you've mentioned this, and that we have been hold our trading partners accountable to the promises they can make. Can you speak about the impacts? And I think you did talk a little bit about it, about the impact, lack of action on this issue for your organic farm, but also maybe talk a little bit more broadly about your experience with as Vice President of Farm Bureau and what you're hearing from others. And do understand I'm under a 5-minute time limit, but thank you.
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. For us personally, strong conventional corn markets helps drive the organic market. Prices are not tied together, they're more held together by rubber bands. So when the conventional market goes up, eventually we'll catch up, and when it goes down, eventually we catch up to that as well. So as organic farmers, how it impacts us the most is when commodity prices fall because of lack of the export market, then it will affect my farm as well. And that's the most direct personally. Our members are concerned, 30,000 members in Minnesota, and they are concerned about losing a market. Many of our friends grow both organic and conventional. Some are just conventional, some are growing non-GMO and conventional. Minnesota grows a lot of corn in a lot of ways. And mostly what they're concerned about is the loss of a market and what happens next. What if it's this ban this time that is, for whatever reason, because it's not based on science, what is the next thing that's coming? So to enforce that, you prevent that Pandora's box from being opened.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Scheffelbein, you mentioned a little bit about some of your trips abroad that you were talking about, and I'm just wondering, if you can speak to the importance of these missions. You touched on them just a little bit, and what it means with a comparatively inactive USTR.
Yeah, and again, and I don't mean to be any disrespectful to anybody, but I'm going to answer it candidly. And I'm so excited about you all getting a chance to meet my family. I have 3 beautiful daughters that are incredibly bright and talented, but I really don't need the government's help in raising my kids, okay? Where I do need your help is the constitutional requirement to open trade agreements for us. And if you look at when we engage the United States, great things happen. When we disengage, guys, lost opportunities abound. And I just encourage you all, don't be MIA, get involved, figure out how we can engage U.S. agriculture, sell the best products in the world to the world, and great things will come. So that's my plea for you, Ms. Fischbach.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Vold, you talked a little bit about the SAFE Act, and you mentioned that, and maybe you can just expand a little bit on what it really means, to protect those, just expand a little, and protect those generic titles.
Absolutely. So Land O'Lakes produces and markets a lot of common name products. For example, a lot of the milk that I produce in my farm is made into Parmesan, which is one of those common name products that is being targeted. So it's really more than a relabeling issue, because if we have to rename the product that my dairy produces because it's a generic name, that really basically spells down to a lost market share, because it basically it just creates confusion in the marketplace, because I can have a container of Parmesan here, and then I'm going to have this newly named U.S. product that most European markets and U.S. domestic markets aren't going to recognize. So the bottom line is it directly affects my business. And again, it's a ripple effect through the industry, and that's with so many products that my co-op produces.
Thank you very much. And Senator Bach, I would have gotten to you, but I know that Representative Stauber has a couple of questions for you. So thank you. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Stauber is recognized.
Thank you very much. And Frosty, I've only met one of your children, and I'll tell you what a blueprint for America. Congratulations, and it's a blueprint for all of us. Your comments are spot on. We appreciate them so much. Just last week, China announced that it plans to impose export restrictions on 2 important minerals, which are both used in semiconductors and EV batteries. This, they say, is in retaliation of our own export controls on certain semiconductors to China. China is doing this because they can. They control the vast majority of rare earth and critical minerals in the entire world. China has a long history of engaging in trade wars with the United States and other countries, and the world's increasingly dependence on critical minerals and China's growing control over these same minerals. It will only lead to a greater and greater threat to the United States and our allies. What is stopping China from banning the export of cobalt, nickel, or copper? Critical minerals will be the most sought-after commodity of this 21st century, and the United States is setting up China to hold the same power OPEC did over global oil supply chain in the 70s. The opportunity we have here in the United States is not only become a critical mineral independent, but become critical mineral dominant. We have an incredible opportunity to export these minerals to allies and partners around the globe, lessening the grip of countries like China on global supply chains. Senator Bach, thank you for agreeing to come here and be an expert witness. On behalf of Northeastern Minnesota, your service to our state is commendable. We want to talk about promoting mining. In your statement, you said there's trillions of dollars. I want to add to that because a leading geologist said there's trillions and trillions and trillions of minerals in the Duluth complex. When crafting trade agreements with other countries, one of the biggest focuses of policymakers is protecting our workers here in the United States, along with ensuring workers in other countries have proper working conditions and receive fair wages. Senator, in your written testimony, you touched upon some of the projects here in Minnesota that are being held up at every turn. One project in particular is on its 20th year of permitting and just had its Clean Water Act permit pulled a few weeks ago. Historic. Never has happened in the United States. Can you share some of the benefits that the jobs these projects would bring and the impact that they would have on our local economies in northeastern Minnesota and the nation broadly?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Stauber. I should have mentioned first in my earlier answer, if I could digress for a second, it's worse than just the 2 mineral leases that the Biden administration canceled. In addition, by executive order, they put a moratorium on 225,000 acres of land in northern Minnesota for 20 years. No exploration, nothing. It's frustrating. I look at those communities, some of those communities that I represent, the city of Ely, for example, and the city of Babbitt kind of bookend these projects. I think, if I remember right, 15 kids graduated from the Babbitt School this year. When I graduated, they were graduating about 150. And Ely, same situation, bigger town, about 3,200 people. They went from graduating about almost 200 people when I was in school to 47 this year. Rural Minnesota needs economic development. Rural America needs economic development if these communities are going to survive. I often say, if you want to look at the health of a community, take a look at their school census. Because for a community to be healthy, you need young families that are raising kids, putting kids in school. And if you don't have that, you're a community that is slowly dying. But the jobs lost are just exponential. And it's opportunities for generations that are lost. And what's problematic is we're not even allowed to do a scoping document to consider what environmental issues there might be. So nobody can even come and, you're bad enough you can't do an environmental assessment. You can't even do the scoping document that would tell you what should we study, what is the potential impacts to the environment. So it's bad for Minnesota, it's bad for the country. Frankly, I think it's bad for the world, because as these critical mineral shortages happen, prices are going to go up exponentially, and we all will pay a price for that. We need more development all across the country and across the world.
Now, we'll just end with this. Thank you for your comments. Minnesota is ready, able, and willing to mine these. And this administration's policies of anywhere but America and any worker but American has to stop. We must control our own destiny. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Moore is recognized for questions.
Thank you so very, very much. And I do want to thank Representative Fishbach for hosting us. Pardon? I'm sorry. For hosting us here. I am a neighbor. I am from the great state of Wisconsin, so I can really relate to the agricultural challenges and the climate challenges that face our states here in what is not flyover country. I just wanted to point out that while Minnesota claims it's the state of 10,000 lakes, probably about 11,400 lakes, but Wisconsin has more. We have 15,000 lakes. That being said, we do need to protect water, and so I guess my first question is going to go to Senator Bach. I really agree with you that in your testimony you mentioned that we could, with the amount of nickel and copper, perhaps in northern Minnesota, we could create 310 million electrical vehicles. With the amount of nickel we have, 200 million, and I'm so glad to see young people here, because I think that we've gone from a place where starvation in the world was a real risk to, with new technologies, with science, we've learned how to do things better so that we can feed the world. So my question really is that has the Army Corps of Engineers said that the sort of, and I don't know if you're in relation with Glencore company, the largest mining company in the world?
Relationship with them.
You don't? Well, they have projects, Polymet. I was just reading in literally the paper, the Star Tribune, today. There was an editorial about transparency being at risk for Minnesotans. They said that the international Glencore owns all of Polymet Mining Corporation, and they were very concerned that the massive copper nickel deposits in Lake Superior and boundary waters would be harmed. And so I'm wondering if that is part of the challenge that you're facing with regard to the permitting process, the notion that the boundary waters have to be properly protected.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ms. Moore. And first, let me say, no one loves the boundary waters more than those of us that live next to it.
Yeah.
We don't go there on vacation. It's 6 miles from my home.
Yeah.
And I have spent hundreds of nights in a tent there. And the last thing I would do is support a process that in any way diminished the environmental quality of that. But I should say, just for the record, that the Polymet project, and I don't have any relationship with them, is on the site of an taconite mine that went bankrupt, where we mined already for 50 years. And it is not in the Boundary Waters watershed in any way. It's in the watershed of Lake Superior, and the river that runs from the Polymet, potentially the Polymet tailings basin, it's 130 miles of river before you ever got to Lake Superior. Mm-hmm. But I think what's critically important is those of us that live in northern Minnesota, we've supported mining, and we've mined there for 140 years.
Right.
And if you talk to, or you can look at the studies from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, they will tell you that the cleanest water in all of Minnesota is in northeastern Minnesota, where 140 years of mining has been going on.
Well, okay, you weren't mining the same sort of things, and so the Army Corps of Engineers is just sort of trying to protect the water. I need to ask Mr. at the end. Wordish. Right. So, can you just talk about how these the increasing tensions for the responding to climate change and really having a sustainable environment is related? Another thing I wanted to ask you about is how can you be efficient and still push back against large corporations taking over the farms? I know in Wisconsin we had lots of suicides among small farmers because of the large corporate farming, argument being we're more efficient, we're big. Can you tell me what we could do to make sure that environmentally sustainable methods are being used while we protect small farmers and still be environmentally sustainable?
One thing I think would help on the environment is take the politics out of it. It's been turned into a political, whether you call it global warming or climate change or whatever it was. But I can tell you about a month ago, right now on our farm, as you came up with the bus, you saw the extreme stress on the corn that's up here. Some of that corn, even with get rain, some of that might not make it, and if it does, it'll be very, very low yielding. About a month ago, our farmers got stressed too on their corn. About a month ago, about 15 miles from my farm, there was an area, it wasn't a large area, but they got 10 inches of rain in 2 hours. Those are the things that are happening. I'm glad to see, for the most part, most people on both sides of the aisle are starting to take that a little more serious, which we need to. So that is a challenge. And as far as efficiency with the large the larger equipment and all that, it does make it harder, challenging for a smaller farmer to make it. In the first place, the larger equipment, you can harvest so many more acres in a day, but that's not necessarily always more efficient though either. You can have a small farm that can be very efficient, but some of it goes back to the access to markets. They need a fair price for their product so they can make a living on their farm. Brad here's got 500 cows. I grew up on a dairy farm. My father had, I think, around 30 cows. Made a nice living on that. You can't do that anymore, and that's the problem.
Thank you so much. The chairman is looking at me.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. You've been to so many of our field hearings, I gave you a little bit more time, so we appreciate that. Mr. Finstad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as I look around this room, I see some of the best environmentalists and conservationists that this country has to offer. And we have done it as farmers over generations because the best asset, the biggest asset that we have is the land that we're going to pass on to the next generation. And so for us, it is everything to make sure that we are leaving it better for our kids. And I see so many folks in this room that are doing that day in, day out. So thank you. Mr. Scheffelbein, so I feel like an underachiever. I only have 7 children, 5 boys, 2 girls. But thank you so much.
It's not too late.
Yeah, that's right. It's a good start, right? It's a good start. Thank you so much for hosting this today. And just want you to know and your family to know that Big Frank was a great man, someone that I looked up to. I was elected to the Minnesota House when I was 24 years old, and I remember meeting him right away, and I'm like, who is this guy? He knows everything. And what drew me to him was his kind heart. He was a good man with a kind heart that really cared about our state and, again, cared about the next generation and what we can do to make sure that we're leaving farm country better. So it's an honor to be here. I want to talk to you a little bit about the trade deficit. As an ag trade deficit right now, we're at about $14.5 billion this year. And our overall trade deficit has reached a staggering $945 billion, the largest ever. And so I guess my question is probably pretty simple. A lot of us in this room believe that we have to have free trade, but it has to be fair trade. So as a producer that's been on these trade missions and someone that understands this, can you give us an idea of where do you see opportunities? What should we be focused on to try to balance that trade deficit?
Yeah, and the beef is so different from most commodities in that it has lots of pieces and lots of parts, that lots of different populations like this piece better than that piece. So from our perspective, the way we generate the most dollars back to the beef industry is get as many countries with as wide a variety of backgrounds as you possibly can, so the varying pieces and parts can be sold to their maximum utility. The other thing I said, and that's why my comments were so aggressive on efficiency, almost always when you go into trade agreements, they push back on the very things that make food available for the poorest of the poor. And to me, that's a disservice for not only the United States farmers, but for the world. We've got to keep our eye on the ball and make sure that what they may label as a scientific notation is real and not just another means to say, we don't want your efficiently produced product.
Thank you for that. Just a quick yes or no. So you talked about your production increases over 300% in the last 20 years or whatever it was. Did government make you do that? Did government tell you to do that?
No, they did not.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for doing it without being told. Ms. Olson, so thank you so much for being here. As we look at some of the trade issues that potentially lie before us, especially when it comes to animal disease, animal health. We look at African swine fever, the avian influenza. What can we do to be proactive and to start thinking about, the devastation that could happen? And if you could tell us a little bit about the reality of that devastation if African swine fever hits our shores. The second piece is when it comes to trade, what can we do now to start conversations with our trade partners about some of those major animal health diseases that we continually to face?
I'm going to answer that in reverse order, Mr. Congressman, if you are okay with that. Thank you for that question, and thank you, Mr. Chair. For our farm, the devastation is going to be a little bit more clear after I talk about the trade part, we need to be talking now about what could happen if African swine fever gets onto the North American continent. That affects not only the U.S., it affects Mexico, it affects Canada. And with our proximity to Canada geographically and the number of live hogs that moves back and forth, we need to be discussing that right now, especially with those two trading partners. Discussing strategies for keeping it off of our continent or keeping it away from us as much as possible. Enforcement, detecting the meats coming in, people trying to bring cuts of pork in their luggage, the Beagle Brigade, funding those. But talking about the importance of that with our trade partners and looking at ways to mitigate the chances of it spreading is of utmost importance. If we don't do that and try and prevent it from coming to our shores, then we also need to be talking about our vaccines and our vaccine banks and that strategy and have our trading partners understand the importance of that as well. Because when it gets to my farm, what will happen is we are a contract finisher, which means we don't own the pigs, we do the labor, we own the barns, we own the manure. As an organic farmer, that manure is critical for our farm success. If we are unable to raise pigs any longer in our barns because we have to depopulate or our grower has to depopulate, that means we have no manure and no fertility for our organic crops, and that will be devastating for us. But not only the crops, it's also our neighbors who raise the corn and soybeans that go to feed the pigs. It's a ripple effect that will have an impact on the local economy that I can't even put into an estimate because it will be devastating. And Lyon County, where I live, is not even the largest pork-producing county. Your district is. So it would be utterly devastating. So it is critical that we do talk with our trading partners on strategies to keep it out.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, before I yield back, I just have to take this opportunity. I see a lot of our friends and neighbors that serve in law enforcement with the Minnesota State Patrol and others here today. I just want to thank them for being here. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. Pleased to recognize the subcommittee chairman on trade, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly thank you to all of our panel here today, our panelists, experts certainly here in this region. Grateful for your participation and sharing your insight. Forgive me for expressing my frustration that the Biden administration is approaching trade with dialogues and frameworks rather than trade agreements, congressionally approved trade agreements that increase the opportunities for enforcement, trade agreements that increase opportunities for leveling the playing field on labor issues and the environment. And so I hope that we can see a shift. I'd like to see actually President Biden take a stage somewhere and make it very clear that what Mexico is doing with our corn is wrong. And that actually, if Mexico gets away with this, it will undermine all of our trade policies, our rules-based trade approach. So I'm glad that USTR is approaching the enforcement issue. I know that the Secretary of Agriculture has mentioned it a little bit, but what a great thing it would be for the president to take a stage. He doesn't even need corn stalks behind him, but just to make a statement that what Mexico is doing is wrong. And so that's why enforcement is so important. And I was wondering, Mr. Vold and Ms. Olson, can you touch, when it comes to enforcement, I think you've talked about it a little bit, but if you could elaborate why enforcement tools are so critical to dairy and corn producers respectively, and then if you can elaborate on the impact of what could happen to dairy and corn producers if we don't really address this issue with Mexico and also the dairy TRQ. Ms. Olson, if you'd like to go first.
for us and for Farm Bureau, all of my farmers and friends in the neighborhood, if we lose the market with Mexico because they decided that they didn't want to take this type of corn, it would be devastating. Corn prices are sliding, as Mr. Wooders had indicated earlier. Corn prices are sliding. We were profitable last year. In 2021, farmers in southern Minnesota, each farmer had an impact of over $1 million in the local economy. It's like $1,109,000, and that is according to Farm Business Management numbers. So that is actual farm data. When we lose our markets, when the prices go down, because then we have too much domestic supply, that means farmers have trouble making ends meet. They will not be able to make enough of a profit to survive to farm another year. Sustainability also has to include financial sustainability, and trade markets are critical for that.
Mr. Vold.
Yes, thank you, Congressman Smith and Chair, for the question. Again, I will stress the fact that enforcement is necessary. Otherwise, our trade issues will be devastated, and it will personally hurt our family farms. You mentioned a little bit about the TRQ. I know there's been some issues with the Canadian markets as far as them honoring the actual levels of TRQ. I am not a trade expert, but I am familiar with that as a dairy producer and the negative effects it will have on my business if we can't continue to get Canada to honor those agreements that have been in place. So with that, again, it's the ripple effect. If we can't enforce the agreements that we have in place with the Canadian government and Mexico, they are key players in the product that we move from my farm, and it will have a negative effect on the bottom line and again on my community. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you. And certainly thank you, Mr. Schiefelbein, for your hospitality here today. But if you could touch briefly on trade agreements actually lowering tariffs for beef, and also the non-tariff trade barriers that you touched a little bit on, but if you could elaborate on that.
One only needs to look at the Korea agreement and see what good things occur when we engage with trade. There was a 40% tariff on beef. Okay, that phases out over the next 3 years to zero. Who do you think is our number one exporter of beef today? Korea. If you put in free trade agreements that work and take away these barriers, great things happen. So I almost stood up and gave you a standing ovation, sir, because we need to engage in trade.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kildee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses, thank you. Mr. Schiefelbein, thank you so much for your hospitality. Look, you got to be all right. I wish I had the chance to meet Big Frank, if for no other reason than somebody who's got that car out there that Hubert and Muriel Humphrey rode around in is good enough for me. So thank you so much.
We met Grandma.
It's a great story. It really is. It is. Thank you so much. Look, we have some differences. But I think what this hearing shows is that we actually have a lot of common ground, those of us who represent the broad spectrum of American political thought. Driving out here, riding out here on this bus, I felt very much at home. This looks a lot like the district that I represent back in Michigan, where we have more lakes than Wisconsin. I'm not going any further than that. And not while I'm in Minnesota, I'm not. But the issue of trade enforcement has come up, and I just want to put a point on that. Enforcement is absolutely critical. Ensuring that our trading partners and the U.S. have mechanisms that are efficient to enforce trade, but also as we negotiate agreements, and I agree with many of my colleagues, and I have some disagreement with our own with the Biden administration on this point. We need an aggressive trade agenda. And we need it to be a trade agenda that comes through the United States Congress and includes congressional advice and consent, which is more sustainable, number one, but also gives us the opportunity as we negotiate with our trading partners to insist that they enact reforms in their own domestic practices, their legal structure, in order to make sure that we do have free and fair trade. This is really an important point. Now, the issue of corn obviously has been covered. I won't get further into that, but my corn growers certainly do need to have the technical aspects of USMCA adhered to, and not have, for cultural reasons, the President of Mexico decide to go in a different direction. It needs to be a science-based decision, and we hope that we can hold them accountable to that. But I want to touch on another area that's I know important to me and also to the folks here in Minnesota, and that has to do with sugar. Sugar growers support 144,000 jobs over the U.S., 2,000 local family sugar beet growers that I represent are absolutely dependent on that aspect of our economy. And these jobs are regularly threatened by unfair trade practices across the world that allows sugar to be sold at below production costs, undercutting American farmers. We have to ensure that we have trade tools to ensure American farmers can fairly compete and support the American workers. Now, last year, Congressman Earl Blumenauer and I traveled to the Dominican Republic to meet with workers there, and what we saw, I would say, is the closest thing that I've ever seen to modern slavery. Workers who were forced into dangerous working conditions, didn't receive the pay they were due often, living in abhorrent housing conditions. Forced labor has no place in the U.S. supply chain, and that's why I've been proud to work to make sure that we can get enforcement actions against those Dominican operations and ensure that we protect the ability for American growers to produce a high-quality product and get a fair price. So, as we move forward in a Farm Bill year, an important initiative that we have to support is the U.S. sugar farmers and the U.S. sugar program, and push back against what some would argue for, and that is that we need to be more dependent on imports of sugar, even though we already import sugar from over 40 countries. This is a really important part of our agriculture policy in this country. And I wonder if Mr. Werdish and Ms. Olson, as leaders of the two largest farm organizations in Minnesota, can you talk about the sugar program and how important that is in the Farm Bill to Minnesota members? Because I know it's important to the folks I represent back home in Michigan.
I'll go first. Thank you, Congressman and Chairman. In Minnesota Farm Bureau, we rely on the expertise of the two large sugar cooperatives in the state of Minnesota. We don't have a lot of our own policy on sugar because it is so complicated, but we would argue again for equitable trade and free trade for sugar as well, because we do have many members that raise sugar beets in our membership base as well. But it's not something that I'm an expert on, and it is very complicated as well. So I'll defer to Mr. Werdish.
Gary?
Thank you. Sugar obviously is very important to Minnesota, and we have two in Minnesota. We have one right across in Brecken in Wahpeton. So we have three cooperatives, farmer-owned cooperatives within Minnesota and the Red River Valley, and we are the largest producing area in the whole United States in beet sugar. The U.S. sugar program has worked very well as a no-cost program when it's run effectively, and it has. And for the most part, the USDA has done a good job administering that program. It's set up with TRQs, because we do need to import some sugar. We don't raise enough for ourselves. But at the same time, sugar on the global market, a lot of countries, they use the slave labor or whatever it is to produce it, and they dump that in the world market at 6 cents a pound or whatever number they have. You'll hear pressure from our confectionaries. I forget the exact acronym of their organization that we need to get rid of the sugar program because our consumers are paying so much more for a price for their candy bars and all that stuff. But the sugar program has run very effectively for a long time. I still remember when Kiki Garza was the chairman of the Ag Committee from Texas a long time ago. I'm an original sugar beet grower. I'm an original grower from the Renville plant. I don't raise anymore, so I do have a long history in that industry, and it's been very profitable. The jobs that we provide out of them plants are very profitable paying jobs in rural communities. That's what we need to do, and that's, as I talked about earlier, we need domestic policy too. And the more of those type of jobs we can have in rural communities, we all benefit. But Farmers Union, very strong supporter of the sugar program.
Thank you so very much, and thank you for the indulgence, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Kildee. I would like to recognize Ms. Moore to enter into the record some newspapers, right?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. I made a couple of references to newspapers that I read today from the Star Tribune. One is related to, it says TV forecasters take the heat for covering climate change. This is with respect to your comments about how we need to take the politics out of climate change. And the other is from today's paper, transparency is at stake. And this is with regard to the PolyMet Glencore copper nickel mine. And so with that, without objection, I'd like to put those in the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you. Mr. Ferguson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my colleagues from Minnesota. I want to thank you all for inviting us up here to a land with so many people with so many funny accents. Y'all all sound different than we do. Despite the fact that we sound different, I have noticed some very common threads that exist between farmers and producers here in Minnesota and those back home in Georgia. These are family-owned businesses in many cases that are based on a few things. Number one, you want a vibrant economy where you can provide for your family in. You know, you want to be part of a community with being a decent, safe place to live. You want a brighter future for your children with a strong, good education, preparing them for 21st century economy. And you want the freedom to be who you want to be in this great country and to be able to speak with a good Southern accent or Northern Minnesota accent, right, Pete? But at the core of that is American competitiveness. Because without a job and a strong economy and an ability to defend ourselves around the globe and here at home, we are weak. And all of the other things that we want for our families don't fall into place if we aren't strong globally. So there's been a lot of focus on trade, but I don't want us to ever lose the fact that we need to be always working on things that make America the most competitive place in the world to invest and do business, and then have the trade agreement come in on top is the icing on the cake. So, Mr. Scheffelbein, could you talk just briefly about how how much your input costs have gone up over the past couple of years? Describe a couple of those factors and the impact that has on your competitiveness in the global marketplace.
Yeah, costs have just gone enormously higher, and we're a high dollar use company anyway. But when you double $1 million or $2 million business, you're asking for a much larger line of credit. So it's huge, and its impact is immense. Then what you have is a occurrence like right now where we're in this drought, and you look at all those investments we made in all that infrastructure and all those commodities, and it just looks just incredible. So we're up 200% roughly across. The way my wife always says it, she gets a bill, you know what she says? Guess what? It doubled. And so that's kind of what we are facing.
So we don't need to lose sight of the fact that we need to be lowering input costs for the American farmer so that we can remain competitive around the globe. Mr. Wordish, you've got a situation where you've got farmers that have higher input costs, smaller margins. Talk to us a little bit about the impact on the monopolistic practices that exist in the processing side of this thing and in big business driving out family farms.
It's really all across agriculture. Mr. Scheifelein, as a beef farmer, does a tremendous job here. But in the meat processing industry, you have the four packers that control 85% of the slaughter capacity. The worst part about that is two of those are foreign owned, not even owned by United States companies. And that, the Packers and Stockyards Act was passed in 1921 because Congress, those of you right in front of us, decided to break up the meat packers at that time. And at that time, there was 5 of them that controlled that 85%. Now we have 4, and like I said, two of them are foreign owned. So we're in worse shape that puts more dollars instead of going into our local communities that went overseas when they made the profits the last few years. We got it, the inputs on tar. We're in a corn. We have a lot of corn here. We have just a few companies that provide all the fertilizer stuff too, and some of it's coming from the Ukraine or the Russia. But the same thing. You just have a few companies that dominate that industry. Tractor, machinery equipment. It's really all down the line. Chemical companies. That's the.
So safe to say that we have policies in place that are making American farmers less competitive and more reliant on other countries than we should. And I want to go to one more point here, Senator Bach. You've touched on a couple of things, and in your testimony you said that the policies that the administration is pursuing, shutting off mining in Minnesota, yet opening up agreements with other countries for rare earth minerals, it doesn't make sense. Talk to me a little bit more about that, because it seems to me that we are making ourselves less competitive with the policies that we have in place right now.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Ferguson. If I could digress for a second, Mr. Chairman, I Googled lakes so that we can kind of get the record straight. And if you believe Google, Alaska has 3 million of them. Wisconsin has 15,000. And if you look at DNR's number, Department of Natural Resources in Minnesota, they say we have 14,380. If you look at how many are 10 acres or more, it drops to 11,842. And then everybody agrees Michigan has 11,000.
That's right.
So
that's right.
Really big.
Thank you, Senator Bach, for straightening that out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The problem we're creating is it's one of more than being not competitive. It's one of being incredibly vulnerable. I mean, we only have one very small nickel mine in this whole country, and it's in Michigan. It's the Eagle Mine in Michigan. Other than that, we produce none. And little cobalt, little lithium, these metals that are going to be in tremendous demand. The problem is we leave ourselves incredibly vulnerable. And if I'm China sitting right now and I think we're going to take Taiwan, guess what? They could put a strategy together and take it back, unite it, and there's not much we could do, because all they'd have to do is threaten to cut off our critical metals, and it would bring us to our knees. So whether it's a good idea to take it or not, I just think we're giving these other foreign governments incredible leverage over us by not having our own critical metals that we need for our medical devices, for everything that sustains life. And Mr. Chairman, if I could, I think part of the problem in this country right now is a growing number of people have lost their connection to the land, and they don't know where things come from any longer. And you know, the copper wire and the copper pipe doesn't come from Home Depot or Lowe's. It actually comes out of the ground. And I used to tell my Twin City colleagues, many are good friends, that when you get up in the morning and you put the milk on your kids' cereal, you ask them where the milk came from. And if they say the grocery store, you tell them it came from a cow. And I just think, as we get another generation disconnected from the family farms, kids don't understand where things come from. And I think it's creating a real problem for us and a vulnerability for us going forward.
Well said. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Smucker is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is wonderful to be here to hear this squabble about who has the most lakes. I can tell you can drive in Pennsylvania for a long time without seeing any lakes at all. So we're not in that. But I will say this, and I want to address a question or two to Mr. Vold, because what you describe in your background is very similar to the district that I represent, which is Lancaster County and York counties in Pennsylvania. So we are one of the top dairy producers, top 25 at least in the country. Have over 5,000, and the size of the farms can really range from small. Obviously, we're home of the Amish, but have a lot of small family farms, but also some larger farms as well, as you were talking about. But I was very pleased, and I was here in Congress when the USMCA was negotiated, and I was pleased that the negotiators, the administration, the legislature had really made the access to the dairy markets in Canada one of the top priorities. In fact, it sort of held up the final negotiations of the USMCA until that issue was at least supposedly resolved. And then it's particularly disappointing to see what's developed because I do think the USMCA as a whole was very, very good. Created a lot of new markets for a lot of products and opened those markets up to our producers. But on the dairy side, I mean, it's got to be really frustrating to you when you see one of our big partners, Canada, of course, really continue to implement policies that sort of protect their dairy producers, and you don't have access to market. I'm just curious how that makes you feel. I mean, here it's handled. We handle our dairy system is different, I should say, than what you see in Canada, and there's a lot of protection there. And how does that make you feel?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Schmucker. That's a very good point. And I will say this for those of you who are not familiar with the Canadian dairy industry, that they are under a quota system in Canada, and it is a very protected group of individuals to be a part of that dairy industry. So it's frustrating for me when we put the trade agreements together like the USMCA, which you are correct. It was a good agreement. We fought to the end. Dairy was one of the spotlights of that agreement. As a dairy producer, I really felt good about the outcome of that original agreement. But I think as we've gone forward, we're continuing to see some struggles with the enforcement from the Canadian side. So when you're a U.S. dairy producer who has a very different business model than the Canadian dairy industry, where we are relying on trade, moving our product, producing our product at a very efficient level, and we follow the guidelines to be part of the safest food produced in the world. Yes, it is very frustrating for me as a producer because it does create a very unfair playing field because my income, we're talking about input costs, right now I'm producing my milk on my farm far below what my dollars coming in are. So it is a very painful time to be in the dairy industry right now.
And if that continues, you talked a little about the impact on your operation and other farmers in your area. Like, what will be the long-term impact? I wonder if you could expand on that just a little if this doesn't change, if we don't have access to the Canadian market.
Yeah, and so the long-term impacts, again, it's like I stated earlier with the situation in Wisconsin. In the U.S., our business model continues to be go big or go home sometimes, which I find frustrating. The reason we went to automated milking or robots in our facility was to create efficiencies without having to become a very large organization in order for us to compete in this environment. But if this continues, businesses like mine who have been in business for multiple generations are going to cease to exist.
Yeah. I see I'm out of time. My next question, I'd love to hear from you. This is about trade, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about tax policy, particularly tax policy in the tax bill that we passed in the early years of the previous administration. This committee obviously also works on that policy. So at some point, maybe we can have a conversation. I'd love to hear some provisions that you think are important as part of our current tax code. But I guess we'll do that another time because I see I'm out of time. Thank you.
Mr. Panetta is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity to come to the Heartland, to hear from people who have a lot of important things to say. But I got to admit, being from the Central Coast of California, what my friend Dan Kilding knows what I call the salad bowl of the world, I hear a lot about agriculture. It is our number one industry there on the Central Coast of California. And, what we have, like I said, is obviously a lot of, we grow it, you name it. A lot of specialty crops is what it comes down to. Now, I admit, with redistricting, I lost some of the salad bowl, but what I lost in lettuce, I gained in wine and steak, which is not bad. In the sense that I have over 400 vintners in my district, and I have the largest cattlemen's association in California, as Kevin Kester will be so proudly tell you. So I'm well aware of these issues. And, obviously from my constituents, obviously from my conventional and organic farmers who I talk to, I support, but also my colleagues, in that, you turn on the TV, you're going to see the differences. I get it. That's what's sexy. That division sells, okay? But you got to realize that there's a lot that you don't see, a lot of bipartisanship that you don't see, where we actually come together and find our similarities. And I can tell you, especially when it comes to agriculture, especially when it comes to the Farm Bill. Now, look, you're going to hear some fights over SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, coming up. I get that. But the fact is, a majority of that Farm Bill is going to be bipartisan. So please know that there are Republicans and Democrats back in Washington, D.C., and many sitting at this table that obviously support you and what you do and want you to continue to tell your message. Continue to tell your message of what agriculture is about, and that you basically demonstrate and represent that attitude that America needs, that pivoting attitude, that risk-taking attitude that I believe is the backbone of this country. So please continue doing what you're doing, knowing that there are members in Washington, D.C. that will continue to support you. Now, obviously, this is a hearing not about the Farm Bill, but about trade and what we can do on ways and means to support you. One of the areas that I've heard quite a bit about on the Central Coast is these non-tariff barriers, especially when it comes to sanitary, phytosanitary issues based on non-science basis. You see it in Japan with our vegetables, Mexico with our corn, and UK with our beef. And so, Mr. Scheffelbein, obviously you being the host of this wonderful hearing, I'd like you to expand and elaborate if you've experienced and how so these non-tariff barriers, especially when it comes to SPS issues.
And you're absolutely dead on. When you get down to what really matters, it's whether or not your beef can get in the channel, right? And you can write all the rules you want, and if they have an exclusion on something that's hard to trace or it doesn't have any data behind it, it's game over. And we've fought with the European Union forever on hormones and the levels of hormones that should be allowed to compete. And when you can have a dish of spinach and get 10 times more risk of hormones than you can a piece of beef, but you can't allow beef in, that's exactly what you're talking about. And we need to be aware of them, and we need to make sure we get rid of all non-tariff type barriers because they're huge impacts for our business.
In regards to those types of barriers, if you can, part of your experience, what have you seen? And what can we do better to make sure that we get rid of those non-tariff barriers, especially when it comes to SPS issues?
Well, as Mr. Schiefelbein mentioned, any kind of barrier is not something that is beneficial for any farmer or rancher in the United States. And that would be the same in our case. We cannot continue to trade fairly and equitably if they have barriers up there that really you can't find a reason for it other than politics. And, we appreciate the bipartisan nature of the Farm Bill, especially, and of trade. So much of what is important in the heartland is nonpartisan, and it needs to remain that way. And we need to communicate that to our trading partners that we cannot make this political. We need to make this practical.
Market access programs and foreign market development programs, I got a bill to expand those and increase those in the Farm Bill. Can you talk with me briefly about your time dealing with those programs and how beneficial they are?
I assume you're referring to MAP and
MAP
FMD.
and FMD.
Yes, awesome programs. They are, just in a short answer, they are underfunded. there is a big demand for those programs to be funded to move more product into foreign markets.
Great. Thanks to all of you. Thank you, Mr. Scheffelbein. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Murphy is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know everybody's had a long day. Thank you very, very much. I was sitting here thinking a little while ago that humans or any mammals walking in front of a crowd here in a place like this, I'm very glad that y'all at this point have not auctioned any of us off. I might make some suggestions, but we'll go ahead with that. But first of all, I'll start in a very bipartisan manner. I would like to agree with Ms. Sanchez completely. Our immigration system is broken. I'm very proud to represent Eastern North Carolina. I've got the coast. Anybody ever been to the Outer Banks? I've got that over there. Large number of farms. In fact, we have the second most hogs in any district in the country. And our visa program is broken. We have folks flooding over our borders illegally now. Just think of what we could have legally, the folks that would come in and actually pay taxes, get the farmers' work done, and then go back home. Just imagine what we could do. With that, Ms. Olson, I'd like to ask you, Prop 12, that great California law written by people who had no damn idea what a hog farm or a hog pen looked like. I wonder if you could expound upon that, what that looks like for you, what it's going to cost for you. What is it? In other words, what's it going to do to your facilities right now?
Well, as a contract finisher, it is up to the family that we contract finish for to make those provisions. They already have one sow farm that meets Prop 12 standards, and they did that to hopefully catch a foreign market. But now it also fits in the California market. But that is just one part of their facility. So the rest of the pork, the rest of the barn space, and for finishers like us, it will affect pig flow, and it will affect how many pigs we can have in a barn at a time. So the fewer pigs in a barn, the less the rent check is for us, and the less manure that we will have for our fertility needs. So it's kind of a ripple effect, and our pens are already at a scientific spacing, so we're not overcrowded. The pigs have plenty of room according to science, and that is how the barns were designed.
Right, so I've been through a bunch of hog farms in Eastern North Carolina. Those hogs are huge. Problem is, you give them too much room, guess what happens to the litter? They sit on it and squash the little baby, or if they let them in a pen, what do? They chew each other's tails, they chew each other's ears, and they attack each other. So there is a reason for keeping them closed in. I was very disappointed in the Supreme Court ruling. I think it's interstate commerce being regulated by a state, but it's going to absolutely affect the way my district has to run its hog production business. Quickly, because I'm actually trying to stay on time here, Mr. Bach, just to go back to this mineral issue. We go back to it over and over and over again. We see that we're okay in this country in the almighty pursuit of everything climate change to ignore the abuses going on in other countries, the slave labor, the ravishing of lands, and not do it in this country. And when I spoke with Secretary Kerry about this at COP last summer, being very, very respectful, we talked about those things. I brought up specifically how we're not going to be able to meet our own demand, our own national security, because of what overregulation and the environmentalists are going to do in this country. We're okay to rape and pillage the rest of the world and use slave labor over there, but not in our country. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, thank you.
I got you on 1 minute.
Back to the vulnerability issue. The American military is heavily dependent on nickel.
Absolutely.
And like I said earlier, we produce almost none. So for us to stay strong on the world stage, we have to have a supply of these critical metals. And the fact that we're okay with exploiting other countries around the world, and remember now, in those other countries, use the Republic of Congo, for example, remember those cobalt supplies there where those people are being abused badly are now owned by China. China is buying up mineral deposits all over the world. So we're going to be in an incredibly vulnerable situation if we don't figure out how to develop
with the
these
bellicose
things
nature that's
ourselves.
going on between us and China right now, we are placing ourselves at absolute inferior risk to them by these policies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Mr. Kustoff is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coordinating today's hearing. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing today, and Mr. Schiffelbein for hosting us. Really I think this is special in a way to have the Ways and Means Committee travel here to Minnesota rather than having you have to come to Washington, D.C. First of all, it's a benefit to you all. It's also a benefit to us because we're here, we can see, we can hear, we can talk, and so we appreciate all of you very much. Mr. Schiffelbein, if I can with you, and I want to follow up with Dr. Murphy's question about Prop 12, because you talked about that in your opening statement, in your testimony. We're speaking here to a national audience. This is being broadcast across the nation. Can you first, in your own words, explain Prop 12 to those people across the nation, and then from a real-world perspective, how that could affect you?
Yeah, and for me specifically on hogs, it's not going to affect, but it's the cascading effect that matters. And what it is, it's the government getting involved in areas they simply have no knowledge on. So what happens is activists whose goal, and this is the key thing that most people don't realize, the activist goal is to put us out of business. Okay, plain and simple. It's to put us out of business. So they wrap around words with animal husbandry, etc., and they try to pass laws, and sometimes they pass propositions that, in essence, put you down a track of going out of business. When we can't fundamentally raise hogs and pork the way we can efficiently do it, it costs us money and we lose the profits on it. So from my perspective, it's a dangerous, dangerous precedent. And if you would go a little deeper into it, you will find the industry was well on its way with a path to get to exactly where they were, only maybe done through a more methodical place that doesn't put a burden on anybody.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Mr. Bold, you talked a lot about, you've been asked a lot about USMCA and Canada and the way Canada has been treating dairy farmers. Can you give maybe some, it's always good for me to hear real world practical stories. Can you talk about the real world effects that's had in Canada's compliance or non-compliance with dairy farmers that you know?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, and I'm going to refer back to the Class 7 situation back in 2017 because that's probably the most real-world situation that I have personally seen people's faces on or talked to that were directly involved or affected by that. When you take an industry like my industry or my business and you get that phone call that says your output for your product is done, I can't store anything. I still have to be responsible to the animal welfare of the animals that are on my farm. I have to make sure that they're well fed. I have to do everything in my power to make sure that I don't have a Prop 12 show up in my backyard. So when you see families like this that cannot find a home for their milk, their income stream is done. And like we talked earlier, in the situation we're in right now, especially in the Midwest with a surplus of product, and also running into, we talked a little bit about labor when you have processing plants that aren't able to run all their shifts because they don't have the personnel there to operate it. And when you have truckers that aren't available to move your product a great distance to get it to another market, you are in a world of hurt. And these families, like I said before, when you have been a multi-generational family like mine and your business is potentially done because of something else that a foreign government did to you. And I will stress this, being part of the co-op system, being a part of the co-op system and not part of a private processor, I know that my milk will always find a home because that is the commitment that my co-op has made to me and my family. So thank you.
Mr. Bolt. Thank you again to our 5 witnesses, and I yield back.
Ms. Tinney is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Ms. Fischbach and our Minnesota hosts and unto all of you, and especially thank you so much to John Schiefelbein and your mom sitting right here by me. It's very exciting to be here. I know, thank you for taking pictures of me and Representative Moore up on a big tractor. She has a connection there. It was fun. I'm going to make you feel a little better, Ms. Moore, because I want to tell you, when everyone's talking about all the lakes, Michigan has the most lakes. I think it's like 36,000 or something. But with Waters of the U.S., New York may have the most lakes because we're probably the most left-wing state here. So we are happy that is not going to be coming and rearing its ugly head too much longer. I will say one of the more important things, though, in Wisconsin, and being a former competitive curler, Wisconsin has the most curling clubs in the nation, and I think Minnesota is second. So there you go. So Minnesota does have something distinctive. But I really appreciate all of you for being farmers. Obviously, I talked to Mr. Schiefelbein earlier. My cousin is a beef cattle farmer. My brother's wife's family have Angus. So we really appreciate, we know how hard the work is. They were dairy farmers. They got involved in crops. We know how hard it is. But I also come from the new district created in New York. New York 24 is the largest agricultural district in the Northeast, largest dairy district. Third largest apple producing county in the United States is Wayne County, right in my district, right on the beautiful shores of Lake Ontario. And we have a lot of similarities as we were driving out here. Minnesota looks a lot like New York. We have great soil, great water, short growing season, lots of cold weather, lots of snow. Actually, we probably have more snow than you do. But I want to focus in a little, and I know, Mr. Vold, you've been asked a lot of questions, but dairy is a huge issue for us, obviously. And I feel your pain when that Class 7 dairy was taken out of the USMCA. It was really devastating for New York. And we have a huge border with Canada. My district actually is almost all of the shore of Lake Ontario, which is bordered with Canada. And I was just going to ask you on this issue is now we're in litigation with Canada. Obviously, the U.S. Trade Representative got a big win last year. Do you support potentially having retaliatory tariffs against Canada to enforce this law so that we can get a better trade balance on the dairy products, especially what we lost with Class 7?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I'm going to just say for the record that since I am not a trade negotiator, I won't be able to give you an educated answer to that question. But in terms of what I've stated earlier in this hearing, I still stand by my comments of being a country that enforces their trade policies. Otherwise, we are going to be directly hurt. So, and I just also want to say that, same with the congressman from Pennsylvania, I actually have a lot of friends part of the Land O'Lakes system in your parts of the world. So I get to hear their perspective on how their regions are affected by oversurplus, lack of markets, and so forth. But I would support some type of retaliatory effort to stabilize our markets.
Okay, so I got one more question. And now that you're robotic with your dairy, I know one of our big issues, and a couple of my colleagues mentioned it, is the labor issue. You said you only had one full-time, 2 part-time in your family. What is your angle on that? And maybe we could ask also the other farm. What is your angle on how do we create more opportunities so that we get more people working on farms? And I'm not sure what minimum wage and some of the things here are in this area. But if you could just maybe quickly comment on that, I have less than a minute left.
That's a great question. And the reason we went to robotics in our family's operation was strictly because of labor. It wasn't that. I think people need to also understand that farms, dairy farms, other ag producers that utilize immigrant labor do not underpay their employees. Our employees all worked 40 hours a week, and they had 15 hours of straight overtime plus housing. And they were very, very competitive in our local market.
Maybe
So-
I could just ask Ms. Olson too, though. I mean, since you're on the dairy side of it, or even labor alone, what is the solution that Minnesotans are looking at in terms of dealing with this labor issue?
Well, on our farm, personally, being an organic farm, we need people to hoe weeds. We used to hire high school workers to do that, and they no longer would do that. So we work with families in the state of Texas. They come up for the summer. They hoe weeds for us. I think we employ 18 right now, and I believe their rate right now is $18 an hour for the ones that have returned, and we have a sliding scale for years of experience.
Can I ask one quick question? Do you have unionized labor in Minnesota for farm workers?
Not that we're aware of. I know it's been talked about, but as an independent, not for us.
Thank you so much to everyone. My time's expired.
Thank you. I know there's been a lot of conversation about lakes. And, being from Missouri, I have to talk about the Lake of the Ozarks, which is the only lake that has its own Netflix series. So we're pretty excited about that. From another lake area, Mr. Moore.
Continuing on the theme, I represent Salt Lake City and the Great Salt Lake, which is the largest saline lake in the United States. So you all can have your freshwater recreation and all that fun. We have brine shrimp and magnesium, so take that. Look, the benefits of sitting on the back bench today and being a little lower on the dais is that most of our very well thought out questions have been answered. I don't want to drill down. I was going to spend actually a little bit of time on dairy. We've covered a lot of these topics. And so to pivot just a little bit, I'm thinking about my conversations I always have with the Farm Bureau of Utah, my ag producers in northern Utah particularly, and it always comes back down to the visa program, labor, and a lot of their frustrations that exist there and things that they would love to see improved. I wanted to just give the panel an opportunity to just start from, let's just go left to right. And if you could, as we approach these trade deals and we try to produce output and make more opportunities for you all, to the extent we're not doing it well is clear today, but we want to make sure that you have the labor that you need. And as we look at improving the visa system for ag workers, what are some of the most important considerations for us to keep in mind? And I'll just leave it open-ended, and would love to start down here with Mr. Schiefelbein, and we'll just keep going down the list.
Well, first of all, at this farm, we don't have a lot of labor shortage because we're those good Catholics, right? So Dad produced his own labor, and actually that's kind of what his goal was. He said he saw that there would be a shortage in labor, and he said, boy, if you don't raise your own, who's going to do this business? So from our perspective, a lot of our family farms are family-oriented, and it's the children that are coming in and doing lots of the work, etc. I wished you guys had a chance to tour through the farm this very day, because they were doing square bales, etc., and see the packs of young kids from our farm lifting the bales and putting in the hay, etc. So I still think home-raised labor is still the best labor. Now, on the other point of view, I do think it's important that we have a legal, effective way to get labor in here. And that's where we get into so much trouble. People argue about the make it legal, make it effective, allow people to come in here, and to me, that's the answer.
Ag or other types of workforce, please.
I don't know if we have as much a shortage of labor as we do a skills gap with people. There are a lot of people, there are a lot of jobs, but not with the people with the skill set to perform them. I think states could use more help from the federal government on vocational training. Not everybody needs a college education, but we seem to, for a generation now, been pushing everybody in that direction. So now in places like the building trades and agriculture, I'm sure, we just don't have the bodies that have the skill set that's needed. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, so Minnesota restores its rightful place with the lakes. We have more shoreline in Minnesota than Florida, California, and Hawaii combined.
Ms. Olson.
Thank you, Congressman. For us, I mentioned that we use hired labor from Texas, but in Farm Bureau, we do fight for a renewed H-2A program. It has good intentions, but there's been some issues with it. dairies need year-round labor. Currently, they cannot use the H-2A program. They have to use other programs. So making workers eligible to work year-round with the H-2A program would be really beneficial. But there's also, we had some issues with some of the wage aspects of it. Right now, with the wage rates, a lot of farmers are priced out. They cannot afford to pay the rate that they're required to pay, along with providing housing and providing transportation and the other things that are necessary. So fairness in wages and making that regional, I think, would be helpful.
That's the most common actually I hear from my Utah folks as well. Sir?
Yes, I'm just going to build a little bit off what Carolyn said, and to talk about the dairy industry. Yes, the H-2A program is a little bit of a challenge. They are making changes to that to adapt to the dairy industry. I just want to say I was supportive of the Farm Modernization Employment Act that passed the House last year, because the reality is that we do know that it's no secret in the ag industry there are a lot of illegal immigrants in our countryside doing most of the work on our farms and in our retail and our hospitality areas. We just need an avenue for those people to come out, identify themselves, and become part of our system, because I think they are a huge economic driver of our economy.
Mr. Bertosh, anything to quickly add as we're out of time?
I just want to say, I think one thing that'd be important to the stability in farm income, so the labor that we do have stay on the farm and have a chance to make a living. And obviously, reforms to our immigration system and H-2A would all be needed too.
Thank you, Chairman.
Ms. Steele is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Schiffelbein, for hosting, and thank you all the witnesses for today. I think we have seen why the United States and our trusted democratic allies must reduce dependence on the CCP. Americans need to stay at the cutting edge of innovation. We do things safer and cleaner than any other nation. We have learned today that Minnesota stands ready to help supply copper, nickel, and other precious metals. Yet the same people who want everyone to be driving new electric vehicles by 2030 refuse to allow for safe and clean mining within United States. The administration is putting U.S. and California farmers on the sideline in the Indo-Pacific region. We should build on USMCA's progress by finding additional trading partner that will only grow California jobs and boost our economy. Senator Bach, California's Mountain Pass mine, that is the only large-scale rare earth mine. Almost 15% of they're producing 15% of supplies of the world production in the United States. What's alarming is that the minerals are shipped to China. We have spoke a lot on mining today. Can you share more about how United States leading in mining and processing critical minerals would be a huge economic boost for many cities across the country, and how it would be safer and cleaner compared to other mines in the world?
Well, to the labor side of it, I can tell you in northern Minnesota, the highest paying jobs in our entire region are people that work in the mines. Those jobs all support families. But one of the challenges is we've got one of those mines right now that's looking at in the environmental review process, and they already they're not even through the environmental review yet, much less mining. They've already made a decision to only mine in Minnesota where the mineral is, and they're going to haul all their product for refining outside of Minnesota because they don't want to have to deal with the environmental end of getting something permitted. If we're going to have investment in this country in mining and refining the metals, we're going to have to be able to streamline this whole environmental review process and create some kind of dashboards, because right now companies don't even know what the timeline is. Is it going to take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years? So they make decisions to potentially mine here, but then move the product offshore to do the refining because it's just too difficult to get through the environmental review and permit the entire process here. So we need help from Washington, D.C. on the regulatory side. I hear some talk about transmission lines, and that's critically important to move the power around the country. But the metal side of it needs some regulatory reform on permitting and regulation.
Thank you, Senator. And Mr. Bold, like Minnesota, California growers send their products all over the world. The United States are currently on the sidelines as many new trade deals are executed in the Indo-Pacific region, an area with huge populations. As the administration tried to sell frameworks over actually true trade agreements, can you share more about how access to new foreign markets could be a huge boost for United States agriculture in places like Minnesota and California?
Thank you, Congresswoman Steele. Actually, I have a lot of dairy friends in California, too, around the Tulare area. And they just discovered their new lake. As far as developing foreign trade agreements with other countries, we got to get to the table. And I think that's one of the points I want to take home today is the fact that we haven't been at the table for a long time. I remember being in Washington a few years ago when we were talking about TPP and TPT and those different trade agreements, and I realize there's a lot of mechanics that go into an agreement with other foreign entities besides agriculture, and those agreements didn't go forward. So again, we just got to get ourselves to the table. We have to become a key player. We have to continue to utilize the programs like we were talking about earlier, the MAP and the FMD, at least to allow our exporters from the U.S. with our products to get their foot in the door of other foreign markets. So
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Feenstra is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I am the last person, so they usually leave the best for last. Thank goodness. I just want to tell you where I'm from. I'm from Northwest Iowa. I'm 3 hours away, just straight south of you. Just got a text from my wife, Snapchat, that we have a significant hailstorm moving through. It just tells me that there's things that we can't control, like hail, but there's things that we can control, like trade. And that's stuff that we need to take very seriously. And with that being said, I want to just say I'm so appreciative of Congresswoman Michelle Fischbach and what she does on the Ways and Means Committee. Michelle and I talk an awful lot about what we can do for agriculture, what we can do for trade. She's an amazing person when it comes to advocating on your behalf. I also want to give a shout out to Brad Finstead, who's also in Minnesota, who sits on the Agricultural Committee with me, where we deal with these topics every day. We got the Farm Bill coming up, and we're talking about what we can do in the Farm Bill that also can work with Ways and Means. So with that, in this year's Farm Bill, the Expanding the Market Access Program and the Foreign Market Development Programs, to me, are essential. All right? The administration is letting us down. They're not doing anything. So on the Farm Bill, what can we do with Ways on trade to make a difference? And I'd like to ask Ms. Olson, if you think about farm access programs or farm market development programs, shortly, how can that help you in your, when it comes to corn, soybeans, and these things, how can that help you and promote your product?
Well, in my testimony, I mentioned alcoholic spirits is one thing that we export. That is a unique market, and that is an important part of trade agreements. The market facilitations access is so important, and it's not just your main commodities. It has to be the full picture of American agriculture.
Yep.
And that is where the importance lies.
Yep. Thank you, Ms. Olson. Mr. Scheffelbein, I want to say this is the cleanest sale barn I've ever seen. Honest, I've been in a lot. By the way, we just had ours closed in Sioux Center, Iowa, which is tough. And hey, I just want to give you a shout out too. You had a recent tenure on the NCBA board as president, and you had extensive trips. I know you went to UK and Pacific Rim and things like that. Low-hanging fruit. What are a couple countries that you think we could go after right away to create free trade deals with when it comes to cattle?
UK.
Yep. Bottom line.
They want it desperately, and it just befuddles me why we aren't at that table negotiating.
I agree. And you know what they're doing? They're doing unilateral trade agreements like with Kansas. All right, they're bypassing us as Americans. It's just crazy. Ms. Olson, I'm firing away here. Quick question: when it comes to when you think about pork, you have 63% of our pork goes to China right now. Shocking, and obviously the rest of it goes to Mexico and a few other countries. But when I get worried about, and we talked about this with African swine fever, that we in the Midwest, this little pocket, Iowa, Minnesota, that if African swine fever happens in North Carolina, that we could be pulled into this. And I'm a big proponent of regionalization in our trade agreements. Can you talk about that a little bit, what your thoughts are on regionalization, meaning that we do not get hit with African swine fever, and yet we could get pulled into not being able to trade with anybody because of it?
I totally agree with that. Regionalization is super important, especially when it comes to animal diseases. We saw the same thing with avian influenza. Regionalized response to that saved other turkey producers and allowed them to have a market. Same thing we would like to see apply in the pork industry.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mr. Vold, I can't be remiss to talk about dairy. And I just want to say I'm crushed right now to see milk 100 weight at under $14. All right, it is destroying our dairy industry. It's destroying a lot of my dairy members, and I'm fearful of that. And so with that said, obviously you talked about the Canada falling short. You also talk about the disadvantage we have with Europe and New Zealand and Australia. Can you explain that just a little more for the people that are listening? Why is it so catastrophic right now? And I look at developing countries and say, what can we do when it comes to cold storage? You know, we can send product over there, but they need cold storage to make it all work. Can you explain a little bit a couple of these things?
Well, I'm going to do my best, but again, I'm not an expert in any of those areas. But from a producer perspective, you know, when we start looking at moving product in overseas markets and so forth, I'm going to kind of go back to the two programs we were talking about earlier with the MAP and the FMD. It really allows us to get our foot in the door, especially from the Dairy Export Council side, to start training these people on how to use our products, kind of starting to create that demand for our products. And if we do that in some of the countries I referred to earlier, like Taiwan, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Middle East, and so forth, those are our starting points to start opening up those trade agreements.
Thank you so much. And again, I want to think through, you know, as for dairy specifically, if we can create more cold storage in developing countries, I think we can do a lot more exporting. With that, I yield back. Thank you so much, each one of you, for being here. Thank you for our witnesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone for being here today. I want to thank the folks in the audience. I would just love to know, how many farmers do we have in the audience? Just raise your hand. Thank you. Yeah. So I hope that you took the opportunity to fill out the clipboard for anything into public testimony that you would like for the record. I'd like to thank every one of the witnesses for your conversations, for your testimony, for your answers to the questions back and forth to our members. I want to thank every one of our members for being here. It's a priority for this committee to hear from folks outside of Washington, D.C. And this is an avenue for us to do this. And so our priorities are working class families, small businesses, and farmers. And we need to make sure that the policy we develop affects their lives in a positive way. We're here because of Miss Michelle Fischbach, who would not stop encouraging us to come. And so, yeah. And we're very grateful. We invited everyone in the Minnesota delegation with the opportunity to join, and very glad with Stauber and Finstad for being here today. And please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. And with that, the committee stands adjourned.